The Meiji period saw the swift change of Japanese society and culture, all within a half-century. One of the most important changes was within the ruling class, with feudal lords or shoguns no longer being the dominant power. With that, the castles and post towns of former Japanese society faced a crisis. What would become of these old outposts that used to be the norm? The latter half of the 19th century concluded with Emperor Meiji seeking to bring Japan's power and prestige in line with Western countries, who attempted to colonize and demean Japanese soil, predominantly with unfair trade deals. This pattern has been occurring ever since the Portuguese and Dutch began trading Kyushu in the southern part of Japan, and after Commodore Perry landed and forcefully opened 2 ports in Japan in the 1850s. The resulting rise in trade afterwards caused inflation and shortages of food for the Japanese populace by the 1860s. Once change was afoot, oftentimes ancient pieces of precise architecture, the famous Japanese castles, were destroyed or dismantled as conflicting relics of the past. The region of Matsue and Tottori in the Sannin region of the island of Honshu is a great location to see the influence of the Meiji Restoration. One icon is Matsue Castle, a stunning image of the world Emperor Meiji was attempting to leave behind. Historically, there are thousands of castles strewn across the land, but after years of conflict, natural disaster, and societal change, only 12 originals remain. Constructed between 1607 and 1611, this castle ruled over this region of Japan through the end of the Edo period. The researchers Oleg Benesch and Rand Zwingenberg discussed the significant loss of Japanese identity due to losing their castles, and their quick demise in the paper Shuri Castle and Japanese Castles, a controversial heritage. They state, "It is important to note that although castles were large and valuable urban spaces in the early Meiji period, they are also viewed largely as useless and even embarrassing reminders of the recent feudal past and potential obstacles to modernization. Militarily, castles had been obsolete for centuries, and their upkeep was a major drain on domain budgets during the Edo period. Daimyo across Japan had long desired to tear their castles down, and dozens of requests for permission to do so flooded into Tokyo from the domains in the first year of the Meiji period. Hundreds of castle structures were torn down or removed in the 1870s. This motivated to a considerable degree by the economic difficulties of the local administrations, who now had to pay for castle maintenance as well as the financial troubles of the former samurai class, whose stipends were reduced and finally eliminated. Obsolete castle buildings were often sold off for scrap to raise money for former samurai, who in some regions were also allowed to use moats and other spaces for agriculture. However, Matsue Castle was able to survive, although only barely, with the main keep being the only building not being demolished over the years. In their place was a Western-style building to be the new seat of government, now minuscule in the shadow of the large castle. Another icon of the region is the Lefkadio Hearn Residence, now a museum dedicated to a writer who brought back tales and history of Japan during his year-long residence in Matsue at the end of the 19th century. Lefkadio was an American journalist and writer who found himself a teaching job in Matsue in 1890. Over the next year and a half, Hearn decided to become a Japanese citizen after falling in love with the country and even starting a family. With this, Hearn became one of the first Westerners to write about pre-industrial Japanese society and culture, and his work is celebrated across the country. Although Hearn's extremely positive view of the country led to criticism of exoticizing Japan and supporting nationalistic idealism, which would be a critical issue into the 20th century. This is discussed in a paper by Nanyan Guo, who states, Subouchi Shoyo, a modern writer who established an influential theory of literature that stressed aesthetic value, highly praised Hearn's goodwill in his description of Japan, while also pointing out, It seems that Hearn only picked up beautiful aspects of ordinary people's customs and feelings, with so warm a sympathy, and tried to ignore those ugly and unpleasant parts by closing his eyes. Sometimes I am moved to tears, although I am embarrassed by his tendency to view things in the best possible light and his highly subjective tone. However, most Japanese citizens still have a favorable image of the writer, and the well-kept residence in Matsue is a reflection of that. The street the museum is located on maintains traditional Edo-era facades to the buildings and offers a pleasant stroll around the Matsue Castle moat. Also along the street is an art museum and a former samurai residence, which offers an additional look into how the noble class lived in the Edo period. This small piece of history thankfully survived the Meiji period and owes that mostly in part to the influence of Hearn on Matsue's population. Lastly, taking a quick train ride over to Tottori City, there is the Jinpukaku Residence, built by the local Ikeda clan after their castle was destroyed. Unlike Matsue Castle, Tottori Castle, which had been occupied since the 12th century, was unable to survive the Meiji Restoration. However, right next to the castle ruins upon the hillside, the Ikeda clan created one of the most iconic pieces of 20th century architecture in Japan, Jinpukaku. This Western-style residence, built in the French Renaissance style, was completed in 1907. Jinpukaku was of high enough quality to earn the visit of Emperor Taisho in 1907, the successor to Emperor Meiji. As the first building to utilize electricity in the city of Tottori, Jinpukaku fulfills its role as the preeminent Meiji-era establishment. It is interesting to see today, as it is also a cherished Japanese icon, almost to the extent of Matsue Castle to the west. With that, I highly recommend those looking to visit Japan to consider this region, as only after I visited could I truly understand the forces that made modern Japan.